So it's interesting how much difference a couple days can make. I feel like something shifted in a good way, and I don't know if it was doing some self-dialogue the other night, 2 nights ago. I didn't do any yesterday. I ended up going to the hot springs. And I also haven't had any cinnamon toast in 3 days. And I've been doing bulletproof coffee. And I've been sleeping a bit better. And I've gone down to 1/4 of a Seroquel. I was on a quarter before, but it's hard to cut them into exact pieces, so I was on bigger pieces, so they were more than a quarter. It was probably more like a third. So now I've been on a quarter for a day or two, and still taking the hearty nutritionals. So I'm not sure what's making the most difference, but I think all of it together is making a little bit of a difference. This morning I rescued some mice. They were just on the floor and they were just babies. They didn't even run away. And I'll include a bit of the footage.
Oh, look, his little whiskers are twitching.
And then after lunch, I just came outside because it was raining and just started taking pictures with my macro lens of some of the flowers and some of the flowers with water droplets on them, because usually here it's not raining, so it was a different scenery. And to me, that feels like my brain shifted back into noticing beauty. And I was talking a lot about that. And then I sort of stopped the self-dialogue process, and then seemed to get worse. I don't know, I haven't really watched those videos to see for sure, but it feels like stopping that self-dialogue and the dialogue with nature wasn't necessarily a good idea. And then as soon as I started having self-dialogue again, and then I go outside, I just naturally start looking at the different flowers and how there's water on them, and looking outward and looking at the beauty again. So that was an interesting experiment without trying to really do an experiment. I thought I was just going to stop the dialogue process because just talking about stuff didn't really seem... It seemed like not a good use of time, or like I was saying the same thing over and over again without knowing it. But whether or not that's true, I think it seems like just keeping my brain in that dialogue state is important, because as soon as I put myself back into it by just sort of doing some self-dialogue in a very uninspired way, but as soon as I did 20 minutes of self-dialogue, then all of a sudden I was writing down new insights that maybe not new, but they feel new. So I think the point is to stay in that process of having insights. And one might be thinking, oh, well, that seems old, but it's still new at that moment. So keeping the brain in that state of newness is the important part. And I can see how that goes on in actual life. It's like going into another dimension altogether. I feel not 100% better per se, but I feel like my brain is just in another dimension. It's not in that dimension that I allowed it to recede into, which is all about ego, me, and coming off medications. And I wasn't even trying to make it about that, but it's more like by not engaging this other part of the brain, then the natural momentum of the brain is to go back to ego consciousness. It's like this passive state, it's like this inactive state, this habitual state. And if one isn't actively aware and present and putting one's energy into perceiving in the moment and having insight in the moment, maybe writing them down, then it's difficult to stay in that state. And that might be one of the ways that a person who goes into map consciousness or trans consciousness or an omnipolar brain can stay in these other places, which is a place of perception. It's a place of higher awareness, and higher just in terms of being of a different quality and dimension than the ego. And this makes sense with all the stuff I was talking about regarding how coming down from map consciousness, we have to go through the ego process in those lower states of consciousness, and that sort of reconnects us to consensus. Well, there can be a mini version of that. When one isn't experiencing highs and lows of emotions, one can still be experiencing different areas of the spectrum of consciousness just by virtue of how one's perceptual apparatus is functioning. Is it functioning in association with relating everything to this illusory me ego, or is it just seeing the beauty in the moment and recording it? It's almost like being a scientist or a researcher or a philosopher of the moment. Not, oh, I go to my job 9 to 5 and then I do this work, but it's like work in daily life always. Working to perceive the actual and record it and sort of make it known in a way. Because there's definitely a richness there, whereas when I was in that other state, there was no richness. So I'll keep capturing beauty. I'll probably forget again at some point, because the thing is that when one isn't rooted firmly in the ego state, and I don't seem to be, and I don't even know if that's true per se. See, I forgot what I was saying, but one seems to forget what one is even doing, because it's a non-doing state that does something without a doer, so it's kind of almost like starting again all the time. Because there's no entity there, there's no image to accumulate more images and sort of fill the brain up with memory. One needs to forget everything in order to see things afresh, and then they feel really rich. Instead of needing more and more and more, the richness of perception can pick out something rich each moment in any moment, and it's not an accumulation. So even if I think I'm trying to do something with these self-dialogues, I really am not. And I feel like now I see for sure that this self-dialogue is important to keep my brain in that state. If I was in a place where I was having lots of dialogue, then maybe I wouldn't need to intentionally have dialogue with myself to put myself in that state of dialogue. Because as soon as my brain is in this state of dialogue with myself, it's then in dialogue with nature and with daily life. And that's often how we feel when we're in so-called mania, is we can just talk to anybody. We can talk about anything in the moment, and it doesn't matter what it is. We don't necessarily have an agenda. And that could be part of the trouble, that at some point in mania, we feel like we have an agenda, or we have a mission, or we have to do something, or there's something special we're supposed to do. And that actually creates this sort of manic ego. But if the whole part about trying to do something, the motive, which is the ego, can be dropped, then maybe it's something altogether different. Because that energy isn't trying to do anything in particular. And when we try to use that energy to do something in particular, that's the ego, because it's picking out something from memory. So if we don't keep score, if we don't think, I did this good thing, and now I'm going to do that good thing, and now I'm going to do that good thing, if it's just dropped in each moment and it doesn't accumulate, it might not get out of hand. Because motive is from the past, and perception does not require motive, and it actually can only happen if there is no motive, because a motive is a projection, and it's going to interfere with direct perception. It's saying, like, I know what to do with this moment, which is the ego. So it could be helpful for us manics to see this mechanism that distorts what that energy is trying to do. It wants to see, and the moment will tell us what to do with that energy, which might not have anything to do with any prior moment. So instead of doing what the ego projects, we do what vision sees in the moment, and then not ascribe that to a me. Because if we use that energy, which is pretty powerful, to create more of an image of ourselves, to puff up a bigger me, then that might be part of what causes us to fall so hard. Because in normal ego consciousness, we kind of go up, we go down, we go up, we go down, and it's manageable in our emotional states. But if we go into manic consciousness and use that energy to create a bigger me, even if we think we're doing that to help the world, it's going to be a bigger and harder fall. So maybe helping the world is not trying to help it at all. We don't see what we're doing, and that's what's creating problems in the world. And by just trying to do more, do something different, it's still part of that pattern of trying to do something. When that energy wants us to see what we're doing and see something else. So for now, I probably can just have dialogue with myself and not worry about the repetition, but just seeing that this process of making half an hour or an hour of video a day keeps my brain in that state, and it's like exercising that. If I don't do a certain exercise ever, and then one day I do it way beyond my capacity, it's going to hurt. Whereas if I do a little bit day by day by day, it just keeps that going. It's almost like cardiovascular exercise for different area of the brain. It's putting oxygen and blood supply in an area of the brain that is activated when one has dialogue, which who knows where that is exactly, but I feel like it definitely keeps the circulation going in a certain part of the brain, and having insights and writing them down, that creates circulation in a certain part of the brain. So what's really important is this insight, this intelligence that can have insight, that has nothing to do with the ego. And all of our brains have that capacity, and I don't even know if that's what this is exactly. It seems to take on a life of its own when I go back into that. And maybe because I've done it enough, it's available. Like learning to ride a bike and then not riding a bike for 10 or 20 years, and then being able to just get on the bike and do it. And that's sort of like having that dialogue blueprint in the brain. So it's important to keep that conversation going from that other state, this state of insight, this state of dialogue, this other form of learning and intelligence. And I can see that the trouble with getting labeled and drugged is it really turns off that capacity. And that capacity is what we gained through the states. And so to lose the very thing that we gained, which was our brain really being on and open to learning and seeing, could really see clearly, and then to have that blocked and taken away, it's almost like having our eyes taken out in a way. So there could be a way to reactivate that dialogue intelligence state in the brain just by having dialogue with oneself and with other people. I feel like this is something the world wants us to do, is have this conversation and have this dialogue about what this energy is trying to bring about. Right now it's seen as personal mental illness, but I don't see it that way. I see it in an evolution of consciousness framework. And I experience being in those lower states and the ego states and of me, and it wasn't energetic, it was heavy, it was awful. And that again shows me that that's the product of those states of consciousness. And these aren't explanations and these aren't beliefs. They're meanings, they're possibilities, they're memes, they're dialogical DNA. It's experiential omnipolar poetry. And I think part of this other way of living that Krishnamurti talks about is this dialogical state of consciousness. It's a different way of speaking and seeing and perceiving and acting. And I think that's what that energy is trying to bring in when people go into map consciousness. It allows the brain to see these other possibilities and capabilities and capacities. Not the me to see it, but the brain. So I can see when that ego state isn't in operation, it's something else altogether.